Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Junto Presents. The premier podcast for genre fiction and audio drama. We bring you an original presentation performed by talented Hollywood actors utilizing top-notch audio production techniques. Join us at Franklin Manor, home to the Junto, a gentleman's club in the classic style where adventurers, mystics, and other unique individuals gather to socialize and conduct their private business. We offer you a glimpse at the strange and wonderful things to be found there. So please, sit back, relax, and enjoy the Junto Presents.
Hello and welcome to this week's Transpondence from the Archives of Franklin Manor. My name is David Parkin.
And I'm Robert Gibbs.
The holiday season is upon us, and tonight we're broadcasting from one of the busiest areas in the mansion at this time of year, the kitchen. Well, at least one of the kitchens.
Yeah, technically there are 6. But this is the main one, and as you can hear, it's a lively place to be. The Junto employs a kitchen staff of a couple of dozen people under the direction of CIA-trained chef Catherine Blanding.
And we're not talking about the Culinary Institute of America. Catherine was a covert spy for many years before making a career change into the food industry of all places.
Yeah, very accomplished, though. A Michelin star-winning chef with exceptional knife skills. She runs a tight ship.
Which is necessary because at this time of the year we get lots of visitors to the manor, and they all need to be fed. There's basically a different holiday-themed feast every night here through the end of the year.
Often centered around culinary traditions of various countries, most of which Catherine learned about in her travels around the world.
Right now, though, they're making cookies.
So many cookies.
Many of which will go into the Junto Christmas baskets, which should be going out any day now, so look out for those.
Yeah, they're really good this year. Each includes a bottle of wine from the Manor Vineyards, 1946, a particularly good vintage.
You don't think they'd mind if I take a cookie, do you?
I don't know, man.
I'm just gonna...
Wow. That was from the other side of the room.
Sorry, Catherine.
That was like an inch from your fingers.
I don't want to talk about it. In this Transpondence, we have something special for you. Part 1 of a 2-episode special we prepared for the holiday season.
The first of 2 stories submitted many years ago by former Junto member Charles Dickens, expanding on one of his most beloved works.
Tonight, the Junto presents Part 1 in the series, The Ghosts of Christmas Eve.
Tim was sick, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his illness, an affliction with a name in which he could not read nor pronounce, was signed by the doctor and the hospital administrator and the apothecary, who came to see Father despite his assurance that he would not be able to afford the man's wares. Bob Cratchit could, however, afford 2 shillings for the crutch to which Tim had become equal parts enamoured of and reliant on, almost instantly. Poor Tim was sick as a dog. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know, of my own knowledge, what there is particularly sick about a dog. I might have been inclined myself to regard a rat as the sickest animal in the city. But the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat, emphatically, that Tim was as sick as a dog. The little fellow knew it too. Not because he particularly felt ill, or at least any more so than usual. He knew he was sick simply by the way his poor father and mother looked at him after their sitting with the doctor that late summer evening. In fact, it was a look they kept long on their faces through the next few years and well into this winter. As of late, Tim had been happy to see his mother permitting a smile back on her lips for brief moments due to the time of year. You see, tomorrow was Christmas Eve, a cause for most to celebrate, including the lowly parents of a sick child, a crippled child. Beginning in his 4th year, Tim began falling down more often than a young boy should. A few years later, he found it difficult to get his legs beneath him in the morning, and the problem escalated from there. He never really grew as fast as the children his age, which was the origin of his nickname, given out of affection by his father, but a name no soul in their right mind would wear proudly on their shirt collar. Tiny Tim. Tiny Tim. It sounded like the name of a sick boy, didn't it? Perhaps if father took to calling him Tenacious Tim or Thick-Set Tim at the upstart, his fate would have gone in the reverse direction. Perhaps, but not likely.
Up there, old angels sing, glory to the newborn King. Peace on earth and mercy mild, God and sinners reconciled. Joyful
Tonight was quiet. Tim always loved how the snow in the streets muffled the echoes of the bustle like a blanket, tucking all of London in for the night. The boys sat on a frozen rain barrel just outside of Scrooge and Marley, watching the snowflakes dancing on the cold wind. On days when the chill wasn't so biting, the haberdasher would let Tim ride in his carriage up into the city square, where the boy would wait for his father to leave from work. From there, Bob Cratchit would carry Tim home, and they'd share stories of their day. As the end of the year grew nigh, however, father's stories grew shorter, and his face more solemn in the night air. He'd never say it aloud, but Tim knew his father had a hard time of it at work. Something to do with Ebenezer Scrooge, his always frowning and always barking employer. Tim had it on good authority that the man had never let a smile approach his lips or a kind word past his tongue. For countless evenings, as the boy sat on that very same perch, the man Scrooge grumbled his way past him toward the square and his large house, never once offering so much as a hello or even a tip of his hat. Not to Tim, not to a single passer-by. Tonight was no different. With the sun well past the setting point, the stiff old man opened a door with his own name printed on the glass and yelled something back inside. "Merry Christmas, Mr. Scrooge," Tim offered with a smile as he approached. "Humbug," the old man swore in response. Tim's eyes grew wide as the old man made his way past. There was once a peddler who visited their neighborhood and offered to sell a bottle of suspicious-smelling salts to father, promising the contents would cure Tim of his ailment. Father had called him a humbug. Often, the butcher would leave a sliver of fat beneath his cut to add weight to the scale, an offense Tim had often overheard patrons refer to as a humbug. But Christmas? If it was the work of a confidence man, Tim couldn't help but wonder who it was getting one over on old Scrooge. The sick? The elderly inventing such a holiday to swindle their way into a warm meal once a year? Tim was a boy of very little schooling, but he did know that Christmas was no humbug. Father and Mr. Scrooge had worked later than Tim could recall them ever working before. Of course, Father was expected to stay until the coal burned out, as to not waste the utility. By the time the bell finally rang on the door, the lamplighter had been passed, and many of the smiling men and women on the street had retired home. "Why, Tiny Tim!" Father Cratchit exclaimed upon the sight of his shivering son. "I didn't know you were out here. Why didn't you tell me?" "Last time I asked to warm my hands by the stove, Mr. Scrooge threatened to find a clerk without a pesky cripple for a child," Tim recalled with a bite of emotion clinging to the memory. "Mr. Scrooge is..." Father cleared his throat, searching for the right words. "Unaware of the range of his voice. I'm sure had he known you were listening, he wouldn't have..." "He was looking right at me," Tim reminded his father. "Come," the tired patriarch relented with a smile. "The hour is late, and your mum is likely worried about the both of us." There were a great many hardships that came with being crippled and poor in London. There was no doubt about that. But for all that was negative in Tim's life, the good Lord saw it fit to give him one gift in which he cherished more than anything on this cold earth: his father's shoulder. When hoisted upon the warm perch, Tim felt like he could see forever beside the old man's smiling gaze. He spoke to his father on the same level and felt the warmth and love radiate from his frame. It was a pleasure none of his siblings had the chance to enjoy. No, this place was just for Tim. It was a gift far greater than anything in St. Nicholas's bag of wonders, and tonight, with the song of Christmas in the air, it was more blessed a place than any holy sanctuary in the old world.
O come, Emmanuel, and ransom captive Israel.
As they moved past the church and the Bowery, Tim looked over the passing carriages and the few hats and bonnets still bobbing through the streets. As they pushed by the large houses in the Frontline district, Tim spotted Mr. Scrooge moving through the square, exhaling warm clouds of ghostly vapor through his nose. It was a familiar sight, but for an image Tim had never seen before. A lengthy man appeared through the lampposts and the dodging passers-by. Tim tried to find a good look through the horse coaches and his father's quick step, but just as the strange man's face came into view, another obstruction would cut it from focus. "Father," Tim asked, "do you see that man?" "I see plenty of them," Father answered as he dodged the butcher's apprentice out on a late delivery. After a step into the street, the man was visible again, and the unobstructed view shook Tim to his bones. The stranger was glowing as if set ablaze by a flame of periwinkle blue. His face was gaunt and tired, pulled down and hollow like death itself. He stood alone in the street, unbothered or molested, as if those citizens working their way home through the chill of the midnight hour could not see him. Again he appeared to Tim for but a moment, enough time to make out the chains girding the stranger's loins and hitching the man to a large iron safe and half a dozen steel lockboxes, which he dragged behind him. The man's feet were bare and knuckled. They moved but only in lazy oscillations, stroking the grey snow like legs of a doll in the hands of a child. Tim watched, in silent apprehension, before another carriage cut off the view. He saw the flecked beard of the apparition shift, as if by an invisible wind, and turn in Scrooge's direction, watching the man with black and empty eyes. Within the fragments of a moment, passing between carriages and the edge of the corner market, the man swept across the street suddenly and horribly until he entered through Scrooge's front door without opening the handle. He simply passed into the hard wood as if it was the surface of a pond, leaving an echo of his shape on the door like a snow angel imprinted over the brass knocker. Perhaps it's the cold, Tim thought, or the weariness of the day catching up. Would Mr. Scrooge see him? Surely he wouldn't be able to miss such a thing. As they sat across a table of stale bread and porridge that night, Tim pondered the idea of bringing up the strange sight, but his parents looked especially tired, and he didn't want to risk another bout of teasing from his 5 siblings. Tim decided he'd do what Mother does when something didn't agree with her disposition. He'd simply pretend he'd never seen the strange sight and move about his business. Unfortunately, the strategy didn't keep the images from racing across the backs of his eyelids as he lay in bed that night. Tim's place was in the corner by the fire. Martha, his sister, had a bed on the other side of the small room behind a curtain. As Tim lay with the vision of that horrible man dancing in his head, Martha hardly helped the matter by talking in her sleep. For the past 2 weeks, she had spent the duration of her slumber calling for the attention of a boy named Alexander, begging through a hushed tone to keep her love for him a secret as father and mother would never approve. It was information Tim's eldest brother Peter would find priceless, but Tim knew what it felt like to be ridiculed for something over which he had no control, so he kept the secret between him, Alexander, and the shadows. Traditionally, the lovelorn dreams of his sister wouldn't be enough to keep Tim awake, but the Bartleys, who lived above the Cratchits, had a gaggle of visitors in from Yorkshire for the holidays, and tonight it seemed as though they commemorated the occasion by hosting wrestling matches in the Greco-Roman style. On top of all that noise, the fire was on its last embers with no wood set beside the hearth to feed it. If Tim wasn't willing to fix at least one of the distractions hounding his poor frame, He was afraid there would be no sleep to be had tonight. Slowly, begrudgingly, Tim shifted his weak legs over the side of his bed frame and used his crutch to work his way toward the back of the Cratchit home, with the familiar sound of a thump and a slide following him along the way. Thump, slide, thump, slide. He approached the back entrance and watched for the pesky alley cats that ran in gangs behind their home. Tonight, to Tim's relief, it seemed the wily critters had decided to stay where it was warm. The young boy looked over the maze of wooden steps winding their way through the alley from the dozens of dwellings. At night, they reminded him of a drawing he had once seen of the inside of an anthill with pathways and chambers piled on top of each other like rubbish in a bin. The alley was a dirty and smelly place. Tim tried to avoid it best he could, but tonight there was something beautiful about it in the quiet snow. As his eyes moved over the cobbled-together walkways and laundry lines, they landed on the woodpile, on the street level just down the steps. As the snow danced across the light of the moon, Tim thought of his parents. His exhausted father and worried mother worked from sun's rise to its set, and much of their labor was due to him and his inability to contribute in the same way as his 5 siblings. Each of the Cratchit children were perfectly capable of dressing, feeding, and using the latrine on their own, even the 2 younger than him. Most times, Tim felt like a doll, needing to be carried and fed and changed each day without end. It was making father and mother older, grumpier, and forlorn, a fate much worse than they deserved. As Tim eyed the woodpile from inside the washroom, he decided that tonight, for the first time in a long time, he would be worth all the trouble. As the boy opened the door, the bitter cold greeted him like the caress of the dead. Slowly, his crutch drew silent arches in the snow as he worked his way onto the stoop with a thump and a slide, until he was eyeing the set of stairs like an intimidating boxer standing up to his rival. Tim took a breath as he rested the foot of his crutch on the first step. The moment it took the boy's weight, the ice collecting below pushed Tim's foot free, and his tiny frame collided with the wet steps, throwing his useless limbs in all directions as he tumbled, one over the other, until he hit the stone gutter and collided with the woodpile below. Well, he thought, without daring to breathe in fear of his sickly body sinking deeper into this predicament, in many ways, that was the easier method of making my way down the stairs. Tim opened his eyes, slowly. His cheek felt strangely hot against the frozen ground as he looked up the steps. There, still on the top of the flight, rested his crutch, undisturbed, as if set there by a quiet angel. Not a step, Tim thought. I couldn't make it one step on my own. Tim lifted himself and sat against the bricks of his home in the quiet night, and the pains of his tumble awakened through the shock of the fall as he finally dared to breathe. The agony, he thought, would be there by midnight and stay well through the holiday. Tim wouldn't complain, however. First off, he did this one to himself, and second, it wasn't fair to make his family worry about him when there was a goose to be cooked and pudding to boil. Tomorrow, he and his father would visit the chapel, and Tim would pray once again for reprieve from his ailments, and maybe, just maybe, the good Lord would see fit to numb the aches this time. It was Christmas after all. Tim watched his breath dance and die in the icy air as the cold and wet of the snow made its way into his bedclothes. It's quiet here at least, he thought. No Martha or Alexander, and no wrestling Bartleys. Tim could thank God for that at least. As he made the decision to begin his slow crawl up the towering stairs, Tim paused as something appeared against the wood ash settling in the streets. It was a white-robed figure. On its head was a blazing light, reminiscent of a candle flame. Was she an angel? Tim wondered. Was she a she at all? It seemed as though the being somehow shifted size and shape like that of a single flame. Now with one leg, now with 20 legs, now a pair of legs without a head, now a head without a body. of which dissolving parts no outline would be visible in the dense gloom wherein they melted away. Where were the sane ones? Tim thought. Surely someone must be close to tell me I'm only dreaming, that this vision came by way of the bump on my head. Is she a ghost? Am I a ghost? Surely there was more cobblestone than gravestone about her. For a moment, the apparition looked surprised at Tim's fear, as if it hadn't expected anyone to notice the beautiful sight. As their eyes met, the boy felt a strange sensation and thought of that day years ago when Dr. Fletcher arrived at the Cratchit home. Without so much as looking Tim in the eye, the man performed tests with instruments, undoubtedly, kept in an ice chest between house calls. When the hammering, pressing and poking were finally complete, the man locked the clasp on his leather bag and asked to speak to father and mother someplace private. Tim heard whispers from the kitchen, tears, and one single phrase he would never forget. "When it's time," the man had said. Time for what? Tim had no earthly idea, but the words echoed strongly enough through the Cratchit home to change the look on father and mother's faces for years to come. What a strange memory to confront a situation like this, Tim thought. I could very well be dead, and Dr. Fletcher comes to mind? What next? A choir of angels singing choruses about Burgess the Tinker? It wasn't the man who sharpens the knives who Tim thought of next, however, but a man even less likely to grace a vision brought on by a bump on the head. Old Scrooge came to mind. Not his face, but his name, cursed to high heaven by his mother. Within a fortnight of the doctor's visit, father and mother had dressed in their Sunday best and left to pay a call on the old moneylender with a hopeful prayer on their lips. They returned, however, in tears. Tim had never seen his mother so angry. The woman was visibly shaking, and upon entering the front door, cursed the name of Ebenezer Scrooge in a tone and brevity likely to have stoked the very flames of hell. Tim and his siblings sat together in the parlour, as father took mother to bed early. It was later that night when he heard their whispers through the thin walls and the words spoken again. When it's time. Are you responsible for this? Tim asked the vision standing across the alley alone in the dark street. Are you a dream? Thrown into my mind by a dishevelled brain? If so, be gone. I've had worse falls before, yet you make yourself known when I sit half naked in the snow? No answer came from the shifting spirit. Perhaps you might shift into something useful at least, Tim proposed, like an overcoat or a leg brace, rather than a memory past. In light of speaking to the cause, the celestial body simply turned on its drifting feet and continued up the lane until the last of its glowing frame was clear from the sight of the poor boy, like the fading echo of laughter. Tim didn't remember the hard climb up the stairs. He didn't remember the bite of the cold that turned his toes blue and his lips into the rattling jugs in the milkman's carriage. As a matter of fact, he barely noticed the pain at all until his mother woke him the next day, mortified at the state of the boy. Heavens, child, she clamoured with a quivering hand as she attempted cleaning the street grime from his face and bedclothes. The wood burns down, and what's your answer? To fetch it yourself with half the use of one arm to go around for the rest of you? What if you couldn't have made it back up the stairs? What if you were to topple the wood and find yourself stuck fast? Heaven knows what a state we would have found you in on Christmas Eve of all days. Are you in pain, my dear? No, Mum, Tim lied, with the thought of his visitor leading the pain of a broken cripple on a waltzing dance through the poor boy's mind. Once she found herself again, Tim's mother hugged him so hard he thought it might straighten his bent spine. That Scrooge, he heard her whisper, with all the power to, and all the mercy of a... One day, I'll show him what it means to relieve the surplus population. She stopped herself. Whatever Mother meant by this, Tim knew they were the sort of thoughts that she'd often bat down after a calming breath. God bless you, child, she concluded. You're here with us now, and that's all that matters. That afternoon, after a reasonable cleaning, Tim rode his father's shoulder to the chapel. The friar quoted the Lord's Prayer as he spoke of the meaning of Christmas. "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors," he said. "We ask forgiveness from God, but if we refuse to forgive, we wear the debts of others like chains of iron." "Chains!" Tim exclaimed, clasping his hands over his mouth as the words spilled from his lips like an overturned bowl of soup. The kind friar saw the embarrassment on Tim's face and nodded to father. "We can't fault the young man for paying attention, Bob Cratchit," he said to the laughter of the crowd. The rest of the day was spent in prayer as Tim served warm soup to the needy parishioners and dined on sweet rolls. All the while, the words of the deacon and the memories of the night before pressed continuously on the young boy's mind. "Scrooge holds many debts across the city," he pondered. "Perhaps the chains I saw were meant for him." When evening came, father hoisted the boy to his shoulder. Tim had spent the day begging for God to take his pain away, but it remained, prickling up his legs and back, growing worse with each falling degree of temperature. "Father," Tim inquired, thinking of that night his mother cursed the old man. "Yes, son?" "Could medicine heal me, if we had the means to afford it?" There was a long pause before father answered. "I believe so, yes," he said. "That night, after Dr. Fletcher came and you paid a call to Mr. Scrooge, did you ask him to lend you the money?" Tim felt his father catch the breath in his lungs as he walked, perhaps the ghost of a memory still haunting him. "Mr. Scrooge," he finally offered with sadness on his breath, "isn't like you or I, son." In no answer came a confirmation as clear as the full moon. How could he offer anything more on the subject? Impossible to believe, yes, but this is how it was, and the wrenching pain in Tim's spine seemed to tighten around him in spite of it. "I hope people saw me in the church today," Tim said, with a desperate attempt to keep the agony from his voice. "Why?" his father asked. "I'm a cripple," Tim said, accepting his fate like so many before him and so many after. "It might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day, He who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. Perhaps then it will keep some from the debtor's chains." Father's voice was tremulous upon the return to their warm and happy home. His words quivered when he told his family what Tim had said on the way. They quivered more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. The boy wasn't sure who the lie was meant to bolster, he or his father, but it was a nice thought to bring home on such a blessed night. Tim's brother and sister escorted him to his stool before the fire. As he sat, Peter and his two ubiquitous young siblings went to fetch the goose with which they soon returned in high procession. Suddenly, there it was, a feathered phenomenon to which a black swan was a matter of course. In truth, it was something very like it in that house to which a meal so beautiful to behold was so rare to little mouths. Mother made the gravy, hissing hot. Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor, and Belinda, Tim's second eldest sister, sweetened the applesauce. As the plates were set across the table, Father took Tiny Tim beside him, and grace was said at last. It speaks to the pluck of the human race how so much pain and hardship can be erased by something as simple as a good meal in a happy home. The excitement in the room was enough to pull Tim from the throbbing in his legs and the memory of those visions to which he had been privy only the night before. Why, the breathless pause before Mother plunged the carving knife into the breast of the beast, and the long-expected gush of stuffing issuing forth seemed a moment of pure heaven to the family, so much so that when a murmur of delight arose all around the board, even Tiny Tim beat on the table with the handle of his knife and cried, "Hurrah!" The feeling, however, like so much joy in Camden Town, was fleeting. For as the apparition of steam burst from inside the bird and pirouetted through the melodic air, it, for a brief moment, caressed the image of a face standing cold in an empty corner of the room. It was jolly, despite its horrifying presence, wearing a holly wreath upon its brow like a crown with the sparkling eyes of a man of unconstrained demeanour. Tim froze yet again, watching the thing signal to the boy's own bed in the corner by the fire, speaking with a silenced tongue, speaking as if another were there listening. Tim looked to his plate, piled to his eyebrows in applesauce, mashed potatoes, sage and onion. Who were these spirits, seen and unseen? And why must they see fit to mark the Christmas season of one so undeserving? Perhaps, Tim imagined as he ate, the time had come to stop pretending he wasn't aware of the truth, that he hadn't heard or understood the sermon of the friar the Sunday last spring when he spoke of the grave. "Oh, goodness me, the pudding!" Mother interrupted. "It's still in the garden." "Mother," one of the young children begged, "suppose it should break in turning out." "Suppose somebody got over the wall and stole it," another voice exclaimed. All sorts of horrors were imagined as Mother moved quickly toward the back door. Amidst the bustle, Tim allowed even himself a small loan of alarm against his mortal fear to wonder about the pudding. As for the way in which the last hours had gone, he wouldn't put it past the fates to deny him that one last indulgence. In half a minute, Mother entered, flushed, but smiling proudly with the pudding in her hands, like a speckled cannonball with Christmas holly stuck onto the top. "Oh, a wonderful pudding," Father said as a great deal of steam filled the room, along with a smell like an eating house and a pastry cook next door to each other. With vapour once again surrounding them, Tim found the courage to quietly and slowly look toward the empty space by the door, housing the anguish of a small, sick boy. Again, there the man was, standing tall beside his companion, visible now, much shorter, with a stocking cap on his head and nothing more than a bedshirt on his back. The both of them went about their purpose, standing, watching, invading for reasons unknown, but suspect in the most horrible and terrible of ways. "Who are they?" Tim begged any deity who might lend an ear. Did every home have visitors such as these? The longer Tim looked, the more familiar the pale one seemed. Tim dared to look but for a moment, but the frown on the spirit's face was... Why, it was the unmistakable scowl of... "Mr. Scrooge," Father suddenly announced as he raised his glass from the head of the table. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast indeed," cried Mother, reddening in disgust. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Father, "the children, Christmas Day." Love, an emotion so closely tied to both joy and sorrow, forced a tear into Mother's eye as she looked to her tiny Tim. For the first time, the boy understood his mother's pain, and how Mr. Scrooge could so easily take it all away should he gain the fancy. "It should be Christmas Day," she continued, "on which one drinks to the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know who he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you." "My dear," was Father's mild answer. "Christmas Day," he said again, now just a whisper. "I'll drink to his health for your sake and the day's," said Mother. "Not for his." The tears now choked her tongue as Emily Cratchit raised her glass. "Long life to him," she struggled. "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank their toast after her, though it was the first of their day's proceedings which had no heartiness. Tim drank it last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Was it him? Tim pondered as the pudding cooled and the two beings faded from the echo of the steam. Was Scrooge dead? Or was he some sort of devil, with the power to watch and gloat over the hopelessness and pain he bestows on the masses? Perhaps these two were God and the devil, and the hell-beast sees it fit to take the form of the most careless creature currently walking the face of the globe. "Spirit," a voice suddenly spoke from its place in the empty corridor, muted through the halls of magic from which it stood. Tell me if Tiny Tim will live." Tim paused. It was Mr. Scrooge. He'd know the pain and anger in that voice anywhere. The boy watched his meal turn cold as he awaited a response from the larger of the two invaders. "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost in a bold yet troubled voice, "in the chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." And there it was. When the good friar spoke, he spoke of the Lord's dance with death, and how spirits became known to those the closer they came to the grave. This was the cause for the pain in the eyes of his parents, the reason it was growing by the day, and the reason Tim had been consigned to the sights and sounds from beyond the grave. "What then?" the invisible voice continued. "If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population." As the words imprinted on Tiny Tim's little mind, he felt the spirits lift from the house. Surplus population, it had said. Mother had used those same words on the evening last. They must have been in old Scrooge's answer to Father and Mother's request to save his life. In an instant, Tim was on his feet. The boy burst from the front door of the Cratchit home and hobbled as quickly as he could toward the two nebulous shapes distorting the falling snow down the lane. "Tiny Tim!" called Father and Mother, their words echoing through the muffling snow as their son moved as fast as his legs permitted. Thump, slide, thump, slide, thump, slide. "I know it's you!" Tim called after the two spirits. "Have you come to laugh at me?" Thump, slide, thump, slide, thump. "Tim!" Father called again as the boy lost his balance and fell to the street. "I see you!" he shouted again as the spirits faded into the storm. Once the truth settled onto his shoulders, Tim felt the anguish tighten once more, pushing his tiny frame into the snow. The next moment, Father Cratchit arrived, understandably shocked and confused as he picked up the boy and carried him back towards his home in the fire. Tim watched the flames in silence as Father and Mother bustled about him, begging for explanations and help from God himself. Tim didn't answer. How could he begin? He simply sat beside his father, who took the boy's withered little hand in his, as if he wished to keep him by his side, dreading that he might be taken from him at any time. Father's mention of Scrooge's name and Tim's sudden outburst had cast an understandably dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a long time. "Merry Christmas to us all, my dears," Father finally offered, quiet and tired. "God bless us." 2 breaths, 2 slow inhalations were all his lungs had left after such an outburst. They filled and emptied exactly that many times. Enough for Tim to echo his father's blessing. "God bless us," he said with a voice weakened by fateful understanding. "God bless us. Every one," he added, before his lungs closed and all went black.
Tonight's episode of the Junto Presents is brought to you by Dreams in the Witch House, a Lovecraftian rock and roll opera. H.P. Lovecraft's cosmic horror tale from 1933 is presented in 16 epic hard rock tracks, featuring former Kiss guitarist Bruce Kulick and Wasp guitarist Douglas Blair Lusick. Available now on the internet webpage witchhouserocks.com.
Voices in the dark. Tim wasn't sure how long he'd been unconscious, but the voices he'd heard seemed to have been speaking for hours. What of them? 2 children, so close they might have been standing on the boy's very bed frame. "He's dead," the unfamiliar voice of a young girl whispered. "You'd want that, wouldn't you?" the boy responded. "Not much to steal from a dead cripple, boy." "Don't be ignorant," the girl bit back. "You!" she called through the blackness. "You, boy! Pretending to sleep doesn't help." Tim opened his eyes to find his home quiet and empty, but for the two dark shapes standing at his bedpost. The shadows belonged to a boy and a girl, yellow, meager, ragged, scowling. "Who are you?" Tim begged. "Do you belong to Camden Town?" "We belong to everyone," the boy answered as he pinched and twisted at Tim's blankets with a shriveled hand. "And no one," the girl corrected. "So they say." Slowly, the boy tore Tim's blanket up past his knee. "Oi!" Tim called him out, pulling the wool back from the wretch's hands. "Rags," the boy pondered. "Once he's gone, do you suppose I'll use the bedclothes for rags?" "Maybe his crutch will be the new dolly stick to stir the laundry," the girl snickered. "They'll use it to beat the rug," laughed the boy. "You two are vile," Tim shouted as the bruises on his feelings showed through the tears in his eyes. "Begone! This is my home." "Listen to him," the girl laughed as she climbed onto the bed, moving ever closer to Tim as he recoiled against the wall. "Where do you suggest we go?" she asked. "There's no refuge or resource for us. Tiny Tim. You should know that by now." "Not with men like Ebenezer Scrooge about," the boy said, "trading lives for numbers on a ledger." "What do you want from me?" Tim demanded, as the children grew closer and closer along with their rotten stench. "We're just waiting," replied the boy as he tore the blanket again. "Waiting?" Tim demanded. "For what?" "Soon you'll be one of us," the girl assured him, closing ever closer to Tim's frightened eyes. "Haunting men like Scrooge, hoping to lose your purpose. Though your name will no longer be Tiny Tim, maybe they'll call you... Illness." "Suffering," the boy mused. "Despair," the girl offered. As her rotten teeth closed in on the boy's trembling cheek, a sweeping coldness suddenly filled the room, and the nettlesome children dodged into the shadows. For a moment, Tim was relieved to be rid of them, but the feeling was replaced by concern that something much more terrifying had frightened them away. Mother's voice pulled Tiny Tim from the dark like the crack of the whip. In the space of a breath, he found himself amidst the company of his siblings once again, each sitting in a semicircle around his bed, watching him, as if death were a Punch and Judy show. "Hallucinations," Mother Cratchit's voice whispered from the kitchen. "The doctor said they'd come when it was time." Time, Tim thought. Of course, time was his enemy, drawing shorter with each breath, and the chains of agony tightening around his spine. Chains, like those of the man he'd seen outside of Mr. Scrooge's door. Chains like those worn by one who cannot forgive. "What is it I have to forgive?" Tim asked the silence. The question sparked a frenzy around the boy, not to comment or offer an answer, but to present helping hands and bring water and blankets. As Mother and Father entered the room, the pain in their eyes told Tim that his time was close, so close, in fact, that it was already here in the room, moving ever toward him. Tim looked down to find his blanket in his clenched fists torn in two. "Bob," Mother said as she took Tim in her trembling hands and kissed him on the forehead, "when you return to Scrooge in Marley on the morrow, I want you to hand in your notice. I'd rather each of my children never eat again than be in the service of that man." Suddenly, it became harder to breathe, harder to move, harder to keep the light from fading around the edges of Tiny Tim's vision. "Chains," he said as he felt himself slip away. The last thing the poor boy saw before the darkness returned was his father's frightened eyes, knowing the meaning of the word his son had just spoken. As quickly as it left, his father's image was replaced by a blackened mist, reaching out across an endless vista. Tim stood alone and helpless as a solemn phantom took shape in the dark, draped and hooded, coming like a shadow along the ground towards him. It was shrouded in a deep black garment which concealed its head, its face, its form, and left nothing of it visible, save one outstretched hand of crackling bone. At first glance, Tim turned and ran the other direction, one foot in front of the other, until he gained enough speed to feel the wind through his hair. It was a sensation the boy hadn't felt before, moving so free, so... Tim stopped suddenly. He looked down to find limbs and muscles free from pain and illness. The boy laughed and ran again. A sprint that became a skipping jump that became a dance through a darkened field. After long, Tim turned toward the spirit who hadn't lost an inch in the pursuit of him. "Did you see?" Tim shouted as his fingers moved over his torso and hips, feeling a strong and virile frame like that of the athletes in the days of Olympus. He admired himself, standing there on the edge of forever, taller and older, with a deep voice and strong hands, past which stood the darkened spirit still. "I am in the presence of death?" Tim asked, lowering his fortified palms. The only answer from the dark shape was the contraction of the upper portion of its garment, but for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. "Is it all like this?" Tim asked. The answer came as the spirit's hood twisted from right to left. Tim looked again across the plain, all but empty, save for the both of them. "I know where I belong in the eternity, spirit," Tim continued, "and it is not in this place. Why are we here?" This time, the spirit's answer came blunt and loud as it reached into its robes and dropped a length of heavy irons, landing at the boy's feet with a woeful clank. "A chain, spirit?" Tim asked. "Meant for the unforgiving, but surely it isn't meant for me." The spirit's cloak twisted back and forth once more. "Then who?" Tim begged. "Who among us is cursed in such a way? Who among us has but a farthing to lend? Take these back, spirit, and reassess your eternal equations." Tim kicked the offending iron toward the spirit, throwing the coil open like a striking snake. Tim stopped, as the chain revealed a familiar object to which it was fastened. It was his crutch, free of its user, laying unused and naked amidst the iron coils. "I see," Tim admitted, as a horror of truth came to the young boy. "I'm not the proprietor of these irons, but I am the reason for their endowment. My death, the pain of which will hold its wearer from their freedom." Tim swallowed. "It's mother, spirit, is it not?" Slowly, the fabric bowed once again, in a damning nod that shook Tim to his hardy core. Softly, the cracking bones in the spirit's hands pointed beyond Tim's shoulder. The boy turned to discover the streets of Camden Town snuggled tight in a blanket of snow. It was home, but for a layer of time and dust that Tim did not recognize. An angry and bitter old woman moved up the alley, cursing those ahead of her with broken teeth and scarred eyes. There was no mistaking her, even for the decades she had aged. This was Mother, alone, angry and desperate in the streets, a woman scorned with no room for forgiveness in her heart. "Surely her hatred for one cannot bleed into others, spirit?" Tim begged the hooded wraith. Before the question had fully left his lips, however, the answer returned in the image of Ebenezer Scrooge. "Tell him, spirit. Tell Mr. Scrooge that he is not alone. Tell him that there are those in this world who think of him, who have forgiven. Will you do it?" The spirit's garment bowed down in the affirmative for one final answer. At that, the phantom stretched out his hand and pointed to the distant horizon and the sun now cresting the shadowed world. "I must go back," he whispered, looking to the new and healthy frame on which he stood. "It cannot be done without me in her arms, spirit." "That is my answer. Let my mother know forgiveness, and come again not until it is done." Without hesitation, the cold bones of the spirit's hand rested on Tiny Tim's head, and a white light filled the world around them. The morning sliced through the room like a razor. Tim rubbed his eyes, aching, as if they hadn't seen the breath of the sun in weeks. In fact, when he greeted the smiles of mother, father, and his siblings, he discerned that it had been at least that long indeed. Tim was no longer at home, but he lay in a clean bed, in a clean room, full of light and hope. There were doctors and nurses among the smiling faces, and one Tim almost didn't recognize as he, and the rest of the population of London, had never before seen this particular mouth turned up past a hateful scowl. Mr. Scrooge stood beside Father as if he had been there all along, blessed with a warm glow that only Tim could recognize. The glow of one who had seen them, who had been touched by them, and by the looks of the new clothes worn by his family, it appeared Scrooge had learned to love they who had always loved him in return. In the years since that morning, the name Tiny Tim fell by the wayside, only to be recalled as the point of a joke by those who remembered the man before his illness was cured. Timothy Cratchit grew up the protégé of a renowned pair of business partners, Scrooge and Cratchit, a moniker known for fairness and generosity. A name Timothy took with him to school and continued to build in reputation until he was an old man, known for his goodwill and loved by all around him. By coincidence, it was on Christmas Eve, only years and decades later, when a spirit visited Timothy once more. He was an old man by then, surrounded by children and grandchildren, friends and family alike. It was then, and only then, as he greeted the dark spirit for the second time, that Timothy did say, "Yes, my old friend, now it is time."
What child is this who laid to rest on Mary's lap is sleeping, whom angels greet with anthems sweet, while shepherds watch are keeping? This is Christ the King, whom shepherds guard and angels sing. Haste, haste to bring him, Lord, the babe, the Son of Mary.
The Junto Presents is brought to you by Dreams in the Witch House, a Lovecraftian rock opera, available at witchhouserocks.com. Tonight's program was produced by Mr. Robert J. Gibbs, written by Mr. David Parkin, directed by David Parkin and Robert J. Gibbs, and edited by Mr. Timothy Thompson. Featuring a performance by Mathew Waterson and the ghost of Dave LeBar, with a musical performance by Paul Whiteman and his orchestra. I am your announcer, James K. Riley, reminding you that the Junto are dedicated to mutual improvement in the lives and business they embody. Who are the Junto? Perhaps, dear listener, the Junto is you.